Hey guys, it's Emily. It is Tuesday, February 13th, and you are about to watch the public portion of an episode of Strange Mosaic that I recorded over the course of the last few weeks with Vince Rado. Vince Rado is a prolific writer. He has authored a book called Drugism. He also has three different Substacks titled The Politics of Psilocybin, High and Mighty, and Drugism. I met Vince last year when he did an episode of Words with Danny and I. I found him to be incredibly well educated on the topics that he speaks about and to be an interesting person with a lot to talk about from his own experience. And I knew after that conversation that he and I would have many conversations, and I didn't know if I was yet ready to start poking at that because I knew lots of things would open up. But I marked in my head that I was going to do it in 2024, and the time has come and we did it. I initially had proposed that we would do an episode on sugar for one part and talk about the high dose trippers in another segment. But as we got closer to recording the interview and after spending some time on his blogs or his Substacks, I decided that I wanted to talk with him about his tryptamine use and why he decided to stop, because I had read some interesting posts he had made about that. So we decided we would do that for one segment and then do the high dose trippers for the second segment. I had no idea what was coming in the course of the first part of that conversation, and we ended up talking for more than 2 hours about his experience with tryptamines, why he decided to stop doing them, and what has gone on for him since he stopped doing them. I have a lot of respect for this person. It is one thing to do what I do, which is talk about my struggles with drug addiction and the fallout from that in hindsight after I've already mostly resolved those issues. It's another thing to talk about them while you are still struggling with some of the issues and damage that was caused, even when you thought you had stopped doing the thing that was causing you problems. This conversation goes deep on the experience of tryptamine use and all of the effects. This is not meant as in any way an endorsement of drug use of any kind. This is simply a conversation between two people who've had extensive experience and are able to recognize some of the insights and expansion that they had as human beings, and also some of the struggles and problems that their drug use has caused. So enjoy this publicly available 2-hour episode of Strange Mosaic. There is a supporter segment that is also 2 hours where we get into discussing high-dose psilocybin use, focusing mostly on Kalindi E, but also with some discussion of Terrence McKenna and someone else named Kai Wingos a little bit. So if you enjoy this and you want to hear more, links are down below for free month in my locals community. You can also get a free week on Patreon, so you can go hear the rest of this conversation. I've decided to put this part out publicly because I think it's very important. And it's, not an aspect of the conversation around psychedelics that gets, or tryptamines, as he prefers to call the group of substances we're talking about here. It doesn't get discussed enough. You either have people who are very against their use, and other people who are so pro their use that they feel like it's something everyone should be doing and part of regular life, and not a lot of nuanced conversation about some of the complexities surrounding this. So this conversation is for education and to start a broader conversation about what's really going on here. Both of us are very concerned about the pharmaceutical involvement and the seemingly propagandistic style push for widespread tryptamine or psychedelic use. And this conversation here needs to be part of what is considered as we move forward. This is not a judgment or a suggestion about what any individual should or shouldn't do. And with that, I will stop talking and allow you to enjoy the episode. Strange Mosaic with Vince Rado. Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer. This is Strange Mosaic. Today's guest is the author of the book Drugism, as well as the owner of multiple Substack pages, all dealing from a different perspective with aspects of the drug, psychedelic, militarization, mind control, political mess of a chaos, whatever the fuck we're in, problem. He was a guest on Words with Danny and I last year, and he was one of my favorite shows of the year, and I've been really looking forward to having him back. He's here today to talk with us about his own experience with drugs and why he doesn't do some of them anymore. And then later in the supporter segment, we're going to talk about some of our high-dose heroes and what the truth actually is about their stories. So Vince Rado, welcome back. Nice to see you, my friend.
Hey, Emily, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Awesome. All right. So since we did that show where we talked like really about, the kind of crossover between fascism and psychedelics, and we were looking at it through the lens of the current militarization scenario in Ukraine, or it was current then, and now it seems like a sort of has been. And I'm actually curious whether there's any psychedelic stuff going on in Gaza or Israel or whatever, according to your research.
Yeah, totally.
That's what we were talking about then. And I know before we start going down the path of what we're going to talk about today, you did have kind of a few updates about what we talked about last time. I will include links to the show we did last time and like promo codes. So for the portions that are behind a paywall, people can go over there and check those out for free. It was a really interesting conversation because we got into areas of like Ukraine becoming the new psychedelic paradise, like all kinds of weird stuff. So to hear those episodes, to know what he's updating us on today, links will be below. But let's do that. Let's take care of that business right here in the beginning before we start going down the other rabbit holes.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. So to pick up where we left off on our talk with Danny, I think at the time we were just a few months into the Ukraine conflict, or had it been going on for a full year yet?
I think it was like probably 9 months, like 6 to 9 months.
Okay,
I think it was last fall, like late last summer or early last fall.
Right.
Actually, it's been going on since 2022, which is it, hasn't it? So that's been hard. Maybe it's a year in. It was a year
over
in.
a year. Yeah. In any case, it was being covered in the media more as opposed to now. But what we were particularly had been discussing that the conversation kind of left off on was there are a couple of groups that are working on bringing MDMA therapy to the refugees and the veterans in Ukraine. And we talked about the politics behind that, who is trying to make that happen, who may be funding it, what their objectives might be. And there was just one thing that happened since our conversation that I thought was worth noting to kind of like touch back on that, which is I'm not sure when your viewers will be seeing this, but in early January, Biden approved a bill that basically allows for psychedelic research with active duty military.
Mm-hmm.
And what I had explained to you and Danny in our first conversation is that they've actually already been doing that on the down low for a while. But now with this new bill, it's officially above board, out in the open. Everybody knows what's going on. So I just thought that was interesting because it was in the headlines and it definitely connects to what we were discussing. So yeah, I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to continue from that conversation, but that's kind of like the main update that I could think of.
It doesn't surprise me on any level, but like just out of curiosity, in any of your, because I know you really look at almost everything connected to. I mean, I've spent a lot of time on your blog the last couple of like with the last week and a half or 2 weeks, and you're broad and deep, right? In terms of the aspects of the, drug stories and whatnot that you cover. Have you ever heard of someone named Jim Channon who wrote a book called The First Earth Battalion?
The title of the book sounds kind of familiar, but I don't know the author, so I can't really say that I know the book.
So it became a book, but like I think what it originally was like a guide or like a manual
Okay.
for like a way to take the military in the future to move them into sort of irregular military.
Ah,
I'm
okay.
sure you've heard that term
Yeah,
before.
totally, totally.
And I think that there is a lot of research, what I call open air research, going on in communities that are supposedly not in the military, but
Yeah,
that are having techniques used that maybe associate themselves more with counterculture or alternative lifestyle, right?
yeah,
And they don't
totally.
understand that the cults that they're becoming part of are having techniques used in the military turned on them, uh,
Yeah,
to experiment with irregular military, and then the opposite as well, that the skill sets, techniques, protocols, technologies gleaned from experiments conducted in alternative lifestyle and counterculture groups are being brought over into the military. So they're looking to have like a broad swath to work from, right?
yeah,
And some people understand that they're part of an experiment and others don't, and that provides a different layer of information than when everybody thinks one thing or the other, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um,
totally.
so that doesn't surprise me, and especially that it's been going on down on the DL.
Yeah,
I think also one of the things that has always been talked about in the history, especially when you're looking into like how did psychedelic mushrooms or psilocybin or however you like to refer to it become sort of part of cultures and whatever it is. And a lot of it had to do with visual acuity for hunting and gathering or from running from predators or whatever it is. Well, that would still be useful in the military, right? That
yeah,
level
totally. Oh,
of,
100%.
of acuity and precognition or whatever it is. So whether the guise is that it's good for PTSD or whatever it is, there's also that benefit to it, in addition to some of the like the derealization and depersonalization that sometimes happens with
Yeah,
psychedelics and
yeah,
tryptamines, where
totally.
you almost feel like you're playing a video game and
Yeah,
therefore don't quite recognize the gravity of some of the situations you're in, or you're focused on a different aspect of them than you would be otherwise, right? And
yes.
I think that certainly has military applications.
Oh, yeah. Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You just brought up a lot of really great points and questions. I mean, first, just on the connection between the military techniques and kind of like the alternative lifestyle or the countercultural uh practices. Um, those two things have been combined for a long time. I mean, just off the top of my head, I can think going back like 100 years, but I'm sure that I would assume that that's a phenomenon that probably goes back much longer than that. Um, but I mean, maybe just a few examples to kind of put it in context so that so people can understand that this isn't just like an isolated i- incident, I suppose. And this also kind of connects to what's happening in Ukraine with the psychedelics. But I'm not sure if you're familiar with kind of like the cultural origins of the Nazi Party in Germany and how they relate to what was called the Volkisch movement.
I'm familiar with a lot of things about Nazi Germany. I don't recognize the term the Volkisch movement, but please tell me
Okay.
what you mean by that.
All
Yeah.
right. Yeah, so that comes from the German word Volk, which in English we would know it as folk, like people.
Yep.
And it basically it meant like the German cultural movement of the German people. But I put that in quotes because with any ethnic ideal, there's not so much of a reality to it. It's more just like an idea of a history that people developed. And even though in reality, the German population was comprised of very disparate genetic groups, um, with the cohesion of the German Empire in the 1800s, for political purposes, there kind of emerged this German identity, even though prior to that point, Germany was actually a whole bunch, it was like a patchwork of different kingdoms that all hated each other. But that's a whole other thing. But the point being with the Volkish movement, it almost was sort of like a proto-fascist thing where um, this idea of like a German identity emerged that was um, affiliated with a whole range of things, including like health food, like turning away uh, from the industrialized world and from like modern technology, which to us it might sound counterintuitive, but you already know where I'm going with this because you see the connection, which is um, by so completely like rejecting certain aspects of modernity ideologically, um it creates very fertile ground for political manipulation. And I
Mhm.
guess that might sound kind of vague, but to tie it more directly to what you're talking about, as far as specific techniques and tactics, so and this will like maybe help people wrap their minds around it. In addition to the Volkish movement, there were all kinds of these little schools of thought that had developed in Germany kind of in tandem with it. One that is probably the most relevant here was called the a- anthroposophy,
Yep.
or the
Yep.
anthroposophist, which I'm sure you're, yeah,
Yep.
was founded by Rudolf Steiner, and he had a group of very close followers and extended friends and whatnot that applied his philosophies, and they would maintain these little groups that they didn't really tell anyone about, and they would do all sorts of little experiments and whatnot. And
Mhm.
the Nazi Party was actually, a lot of the high level Nazis were very into anthroposophy,
Yep.
and they saw it as kind of like a philosophy with which they could prove the, the ideals of the Nazi Party that had emerged from the Volkish movement of like, we have to return back to the ways of the true Germans, back to our roots, all this BS. But anthroposophy was kind of like a quasi-scientific way of thinking. It hasn't a lot of its main, I don't even want to get bogged down in that. But
Yeah.
the point here is that it emerged from this kind of space in Germany that had a lot of values that now we might associate with the counterculture or the hippies.
Yes.
But in the broader context of history, it was actually a phenomenon that directly set the stage for fascism and
Mhm.
authoritarian uh, dictatorship, basically. And the very things that they supposedly wanted to fight against, like the mechanization of the world and the over-industrialization and everything, the Nazi Party actually became guilty of those very things, despite emerging from a cultural space that professed being attached to the very opposite things.
Mhm.
And a lot of techniques from anthroposophy were actually directly applied to what the Nazis were doing, like in the
Mhm.
concentration camps. So this actually continues from our last conversation. I don't know if we had time to get into this, but in Ukraine in World War II, the Nazis actually had established an herbal plantation because they wanted they wanted to grow these natural drugs
Mhm.
to get Germany, like they were hip, of course, to what the Rockefellers were doing to medicine and the petroleum derived stuff, because of course the Germans were knee deep in all of that as well. You know, they were working with Rockefeller funded uh, chemists to create new drugs from like coal tars and stuff like that. But part of this anthroposophy thing that emerged in the and that the Nazis became attached to was they built an herbal plantation and they had plans for more that they wanted to build all throughout um, Ukraine, where they would grow large fields of herbs with the forced labor, of course, of the concentration camp prisoners, um, where then they would grow these all natural, pure products for the German population to reduce their dependence on any other drug markets.
Hmm.
Um, and at the same time that they were doing that, they also were using various like botanically it, it, it derived drugs and experiments on the prisoners at the concentration camps. I think we did get into this in our last talk, because we explained that this is the context that the first Americans, that, well, not the very first, but when psychedelic research really began to pick up in the US in a big way, it was directly inspired by what the Nazis were doing in World War II. But what's interesting is that at the same time that the Nazis were experimenting with mescaline and opioids and all these various drugs and seeing how they could be used to alter and control behavior. And there's one nurse that worked with the Nazis that's on record as saying that their goal was to eliminate the free will of the individual
Hmm.
with things like mescaline. And then at the same time, they are building these like natural herb plantations because they want to get Germany back on the botanical drugs, but they want to grow it with the labor of prisoners. This very complicated and weird how the ideologies are kind of like fused. And you see a very similar thing going on right now with like the psychedelics and the drug legalization movement, where there's a lot of different motivations that are kind of playing out at the same time. And it's not very clear like who is serving whose agenda. And
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
anyway, that I just gave you a lot, but there's more I could get into, but that's just kind of my initial response. I guess there's just a couple other things to kind of like move on from that. I mean, that's just some historical context to kind of show folks that this is not anything new and that there's a history of this that has directly informed what's happening right now. But as far as specifically like right now, like how could the psychedelics be used in the military? And then like you were talking about uh the phenomenon of like derealization and depersonalization and um how there are people who want life to feel more like a game and how that might be used for social control and stuff. The first thing real quick is there's at least one article. There's probably more since then. This one came out in either 2018 or maybe 2019, but it was published by, I forget his name off the top of my head, but they do scholarly work about the military and like warfare uh, techniques and whatnot. And the whole article was about how microdosing psychedelics might be advantageous to active duty people on the field while they are killing people.
Hmm.
And it's like what you said, where he argues like, oh, they have been shown to enhance the visual acuity, and they may make people more detail oriented and able to decipher breaks from a pattern. So if people are hosted up in one spot, like watching for someone to move for hours at a time, and they need to instantly kill that person the split second that they move,
Yep.
like having them on like a microdose of some acid or some MDMA might help them get through that and have the mental acuity to maintain. And he goes really into detail. Now, what's interesting is the science behind this is iffy. I mean, on the one hand, we know that these drugs can do this because a lot of us have personal experience where they have had that effect, but whether or not they can reliably induce precisely the desired effects in a way that is advantageous to military. I mean, that's the subject of debate. There's an author from Germany named Norman Ohler who's devoted a lot of research to this, exploring how the use of drugs in warfare by the Nazis, and there's another scholar in Poland. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I don't want to butcher it, but there are people who have written whole books about like when militaries use drugs, they do so with the intent that it will serve a certain purpose. Um, but because drug use can be chaotic, it doesn't always turn out that way, and blah blah blah. So that's the whole thing right there. But then, so that article, again, the title off the top of my head, I don't know. But if folks search microdosing, the military, um, 2018 or 19, it was published in a scholarly journal. It should be pretty easy to locate for folks. If you're really interested, I can find it and send you a link to share with your viewers. But the next point real quick, and then we can kind of move on or whatever. But the video game thing I just thought was really interesting because specifically applied to the military, that actually already like are you familiar with how they use the controllers from video games?
For drone warfare. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, if we consider that, I mean, they're all I haven't seen like a piece of paper that proves undoubtedly that the video game industry was encouraged by the military so that it would train kids on this stuff, but it does leave us asking those sorts of questions, right?
Yes.
And then what is interesting, I thought, because that all of this stuff came to my mind when I saw that Biden passed the bill for the psychedelic research with the military, because I already know they've been doing psychedelic research with the military recently. Like, I'm not even talking about in the MK Ultra days. I'm talking about like within the last 5-10 years that they have not been telling anybody about except for like a few key people. And the fact that they're now announcing it to the public would suggest to me that it's actually past the research phase.
Yes.
And I don't want to assume, but I would imagine that they're currently devising all sorts of ways to really actively incorporate it into the routines of troops. And I shared a link with you. When this happened, I was trying to think of how this might play out, and um, I don't know. I mean, when you have the idea that we have kids in some cases who haven't even, they're like teenagers in some cases, or maybe in their young 20s, peak testosterone. They've been playing video games, active shooter video games their whole life, and now they're given the same setup, and the characters happen to be real people, but do they actually know the difference? It's debatable. And now, if they encounter any emotional turmoil from killing too many actual people with their little pogo stick, they will have access to pharmaceutical grade MDMA
Right.
and a therapist to personally hold their hand and walk them through their problems. I'm just like, this to me is crazy because I've been talking about this potentially coming to be for
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
And it's here. Like, it is here. Like, I don't know specifically that exact thing that I just said is exactly how it is being played out right now. But based on my research and my work with people in the field, that's just like a rough sketch of how I would envision it probably will be going before long if it's not already happening.
I'll take it one step further, right?
Yeah.
I'll take it one step further. My guess would be they're already to the place where they're trying to do preventative medicine. So they're giving people the MDMA or the mushrooms or the acid beforehand in small homeopathic doses to prevent them getting PTSD for any of these things, because PTSD has become an expensive problem for the VA to deal with and has become part of the social complaint when it comes to like why people don't want lots of immigration, because we can't even take care of our vets and they're homeless living on the street and all this kind of stuff. Right.
Absolutely.
So now we have a situation where people can front load, kind of like taking, certain supplements before you eat ecstasy at a party or before you get drunk and you don't have as bad of a hangover or whatever. Like, I bet you that's where they're at right now. And the other thing that I bet is they're having trouble with recruitment, right? A lot of people
Yes.
left the military during the
Yeah.
pandemic for a variety of reasons. And they're trying to call some of them back without like even an apology or like some sort of making them whole based on what had happened during that time. And they're having trouble to get people to want to sign up for it. One
Yeah.
of the techniques I think that they
Yeah.
would use would
Yeah.
be, hey, and you'll get to participate in this psychedelic research or these gaming types of things. And you're going to have kids who got really used to not leaving their house during the pandemic and have anti-anxiety, social disorders, anxiety and social disorders and things like that. But if they're going to know, oh, I get to sit in a pod all day and do psychedelics and play video games, like I'll sign up for that. Like that works for the sort of the situation that has become my life,
Yeah.
right? So I
Totally.
think there's a lot of things going on there.
Yeah, I agree with you on both points 100%. I think that's very much on point. The thing with how it's become a political problem for the VA and they're trying to find a way to save costs, that's 100% on point. I hadn't thought about them doing it as a preventative thing, but that's very interesting. And that has already been going on unofficially, and that there is a culture of tripping in the military. A
Right.
lot of people wouldn't think so, but there's tons of examples of kids on military bases and new recruits and stuff who have been caught, like little like rings of people who would do acid together or Molly or shrooms or whatever. And then what you said about how they will probably use this as an incentive to try to recruit people into the military, I 100% agree with that. I actually had come to the same conclusion and had been telling folks that as well. So I'm glad that I'm not the only one who could see where this is most
I,
likely headed.
I
Yeah,
couldn't believe, like, in
yeah,
the peak of the rave days in the 90s, how
yeah.
many people who went to raves were active duty military that would
Yes.
get a weekend pass away from the base, come
Yeah,
into Austin or come into LA or wherever I was living at the time,
yeah,
party all weekend, and
yeah,
then
yeah,
go back and just like, either hope that they weren't drug tested or they knew they weren't because secretly
yeah,
they were already part of a project to see
yeah,
if
yeah.
right.
Well,
Like, think about that.
yeah,
If
oh,
you
totally.
if you put your psychedelic research on a
Yeah,
base that is close to a city where there's a lot of rave scene or nightclub culture or a lot of that sort of counterculture that has a lot of that going on, and you give them weekend passes and they're going to that, they're going, right? What a perfect way to do just sort of an hands off the
yeah,
books observational research
yeah,
study to
totally.
see if these people perform better, if these people show less, emotional
Yeah,
scar tissue from otherwise traumatizing things than those who don't. I mean, there's like all kinds of things I can
yeah.
imagine.
Oh, totally, totally. And there actually is an example of there was a rave that happened in the Mission District of San Francisco.
On a military base.
I don't know. I think it was in a church. I don't know if
Okay.
there was a explicit military connection, but it was organized by Bob Jesse,
Mm-hmm.
who worked for years at Oracle, which was started to serve the CIA. I mean, basically like a front company. I mean, of course, they would say, no, we're not a front company for the CIA. But if you look at the history of the company, they were started to serve you know the drill with them. But uh, Bob Jesse was I forget his exact title, but he was some sort of like manager or more upper level position at Oracle, and then he left because he supposedly had a trip and all of a sudden decided he wanted to get into the psychedelic therapy. He ran this rave at a church in San Francisco for a few years that they had to really I don't think they completely closed it down, but I think they may have changed locations because there were there was at least one or possibly more hospitalizations of people who had attended the rave and took too much of something and wound up, I forget the exact details, but there was at least one hospitalization that caused some controversy and they had to move locations. And I don't think the rave happens anymore. I think it was shut down entirely some years ago. But that is an interesting thing that, I've been aware of Bob Jesse and his work for years and years and years. And I didn't know that this aspect of his of his work until quite recently, like really digging deep into some stuff. And I just thought that was interesting because, I mean, I don't know that this was done as like a project for the military, but I think it's interesting that this dude who was working at a tech company with such direct connections to the intelligence establishment also happened to be hosting a little rave where people were being hospitalized from overdoses on. It's like very strange stuff, and it was not that long ago.
Well,
But
and he also is now heading up parts of the psychedelic research thing at Hopkins, at Johns
exactly.
Hopkins.
Well, yeah,
So,
and yeah, that's what he went on to start after the rave thing. Like he
right.
moved over to Hopkins and they started doing it in laboratories. So I'm just like,
So
all right,
a couple of things. So
yeah,
I sort of can't believe, but also am equally not surprised that you bring up Oracle, right?
yeah,
Because that's a lot. I mean, a lot of my threads from my various things that I like to research, all come
yep,
back to
yeah.
Oracle. And I just happen to live about 300 feet from Oracle. My apartment is 300 feet from Oracle.
Oh
And
man,
I'll just tell you, like, I've had very strange moments of awareness that I was lured here to participate in a psychedelic experiment that Oracle was running, and that like the building that I live in is part of it, because very strange things go on in this building. We can talk about that a separate time. My listeners will know some of the things that I'm referring to. Doesn't surprise me. There was a rave here in Austin on a military base called Airport in the late 90s and early 2000s. Like literally there was like army people guarding the party, right?
wow.
And we should have had more questions then than we did. I don't know why we didn't.
Yeah.
But also, I don't know if you've ever heard of, I'm sure you have, but you're very well aware of the whole club kid scene in New York City with Michael Alec, the whole disco bloodbath kind of thing. You know what I'm talking about?
Not
With
so
like
much.
the club kid scene with like all the crazy clothes, and he killed a person and chopped their body up and put them in the river. There was a
Oh,
documentary made about him. He died a couple of years ago, weirdly, like just hours after I did it and recorded a show about him.
oh
He like, it was very
wow.
weird the way that it kind of
Yeah,
happened.
yeah,
But he used to host a party at the Limelight with a hospital theme,
huh,
right? And that was all
yeah.
about like weird experiments and doing things, right, kind of thing. And there's definitely a lot of questions about what kind of intelligence operations were going on through his events, right? So
Yeah.
there's some more things for you to look into.
Okay,
But
interesting.
Oracle is very they're into all kinds of things,
Mhm.
and it's very odd how they end up wherever I go. The only other
Yeah.
thing that ends up everywhere I go is the church, is Scientology,
Oh
right?
wow. Interesting.
This is once I moved here this last time, though, this is the first time that after moving somewhere, a Scientology office didn't open right in the neighborhood,
Oh
right?
wow.
Generally, well, what's weird is like, and this is goes for Danny as well. The hospital that we were born at is now the Church of Scientology, like the main celebrity center in Los Angeles. It used to be
Yeah,
Cedars of
wow.
Lebanon Hospital, right?
Wow.
So I think there's some of these programs that have been farmed out to the Church of Scientology to sort of maintain,
Yes.
right? Okay. So I think let's leave that where we've left that. I think we just
Okay.
opened a bunch of
Yeah.
rabbit holes to go down in future conversations. But I kind of want to turn, when you came on with Danny and I, aside from all the interesting things related to psychedelics and fascism and Ukraine that we got into, you told us a little bit how you got into doing the work you do through your activism and all of that kind of stuff. Today, like, I wanted to spend a little time talking about your own personal history with the substances and how that played into, what you do, but also, how your relationship with them has developed over time and how that informs especially like your writings and some of the paths you find yourself traveling that are much different than when you first started. So
Okay.
just kind of, wherever you want to start with that, and wherever you want to go,
Okay.
it'll be interesting regardless which path you take. So
Yeah. Okay. Um, yeah, I mean, well, I'll focus on the tryptamines and the psychedelics for now, just because that's kind of the theme of our discussion. But whenever people ask me about my drug use, I always start with salt and sugar
yeah.
and chocolate and coffee
Mm-hmm.
and all these things that are totally drugs that all of us are raised to think are like normal, but that actually kill more people than all illegal drugs combined. Well, not coffee and chocolate, but salt and sugar do. And I was using those things habitually, um, from out the womb, like all of us were. So I just want to say that first, because we don't very often think of those things as drugs, but they are. But I'll spare you the rant about salt. But as far as like the drugs that are more pertinent to our discussion, I mean, I began smoking weed in high school. I mean, at my high school, kids just did a lot of drugs. I don't know how else to put it. It was very easy to access, and a lot like all the people I got along the best with smoked weed every day. So I fell in with that crowd very quickly. The I gravitated toward weed, and I was smoking it every day within a few months of the first time I tried it. Um, and I I don't know if I had already developed by then, but if I hadn't, I definitely did at some point develop an interest. Like there was a long phase as a teenager, I'm sure a lot of our listeners can relate, where I wanted to do all the drugs. Like as soon as I smoked weed and I realized it was great, and all the drug war propaganda is false, and ooh, I wonder what else they lied about. I want to try it all, right? I'm sure a lot of people kind of went through the same thing or something similar. And in high school and through my teenage years, I did like any drug I could get my hands on. I as much as I could get my hands on it, basically. And what I gravitated toward was like the acid and the DMT and the mushrooms for whatever reason. That's just the high that I liked the most, and it was easy to access. Um, so I mean,
Did you grow
I
up in the
guess
DC area? I know you live there now, but
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, and I mean, I had started using like ketamine and LSD by the time I was a junior in high school. And then I actually kind of got in trouble and almost got kicked out of high school. But because I had really excellent grades, they let me do this thing where I basically went to school over the summer and got my degree or my diploma. And they didn't kick me out, even though, because I hadn't really messed up that bad. But it was just like some teenager shit, high school. But I had A's, and they were like, "What's up?" And I was like, "I don't know." And they were like, "All right, get out of here." So I wound up graduating a year early from high school
Hmm.
in the midst of like dabbling in acid and ketamine on the weekends and getting high every day. So I thought I was like the shit. I thought I was like the coolest thing ever. I was like, "Oh, I'm so smart. I graduated from school early and I'm doing drugs. Like, this is awesome. I must be a genius. I am just gonna do whatever I want because I'm, so smart." And it was really stupid, just like typical teenager, like very full of myself. Although at the time I wouldn't have admitted that or seen it, but and I had no intention of going to school, and I just basically, I mean, I got a job, but I spent all my time just pursuing drug use. That was my main interest. I mean, I played in a, a couple bands, played music, had a little job and stuff, but my main interest was just trying to get as high as possible, on as many different things as possible. And then after a couple years of that, I wound up in a lot of trouble. But I mean, at that time, I was again, it was really like in my teenage years, it was like the acid and the DMT that I really gravitated toward. I think at the time it's because like both of those drugs, the DMT for one, it's like very quick,
Hmm.
uh, and it's not often compared to like, well, it is occasionally compared to other drugs in the crystal form that are smoked with a torch from glass pipes. But it definitely, I don't know if you've ever partaken, but the rush from DMT is like it's pretty great. And when people couch it in all sorts of like this mystical spiritual stuff, but I don't really see it that way. I've done it a bunch to where I've gotten past all that shit, and to me it's just a fucking drug that gets me really high, and I know what it does to my brain, and I've done it enough times that I can feel it happening, and I don't feel the need to couch it in like these metaphors and stuff
Yep.
to kind of explain it to people. But um it is really just a fucking great high. Like there were times when I was like a teenager where I would just like sit down and just smoke DMT, just like take hits back to back, and then maybe go out and smoke some weed and come back and smoke some more DMT, like because I just loved it that much. But and I was also dabbling in a whole bunch of other stuff, like the acid, for example. I think I
Real quick,
was
before you go to
yeah,
acid, can I ask you a
yeah,
couple of questions? Because
yeah.
actually, I have not partaken of DMT. One of
Okay.
my, well, I'll put it this way. I have not as a fully present and aware adult Emily Moyer, but
Right.
I think we chatted a little bit maybe last time about there being some overlap with the circumstances of my life that match some versions of MK Ultra kind of projects.
Yeah, totally.
And when people, the very first time I ever heard people describing DMT, it sounded very familiar to me. Like what they were
Yeah.
describing, it's like, I've been there, right?
Yes.
So when I'm saying that I haven't partaken, I've not, as an adult, been like, I'm going to smoke some
Hope the
DMT.
drug. Yeah.
Right now, I'm not opposed to it, but one of the sort of guide rails I've often had for myself is that, like, if I naturally come across it, then that's the time to engage, as opposed to like seeking it out. Right. Like when the right time, it's kind of like when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. When
Yes.
the vessel is ready, the gas will, whatever it is. Right. Like it's been
Yeah.
kind of like that. So that's the main reason.
Yeah.
I have lots of reasons to be interested in doing it. So it's just about alignment with reality that way, per
Yeah.
se. But can you
Yeah.
explain to me, when you
Yeah.
say it's a really great high, right? What does that mean to you? Because like I'm one of those people, like I don't like weed. To me, that's not a really great high.
Yeah.
But I really liked coke. I really liked meth. I really like mushrooms. I loved acid for a while. They're all
Yeah.
very different from one another. And I
Yeah.
know what they are, but what's a really great high to you? Aside, don't give me any of the metaphors. Like I know what
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
people say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Give me the Vince Rado. This is a great high.
Okay. First, I just want to put a disclaimer that I don't encourage people to use these things.
Agreed.
The DMT is like very strong and should be used with caution. So by no means, I know I can speak about it in a way that's like, oh my God, I loved it, but I wouldn't encourage you to like even if you had the
You don't use
opportunity.
it. You don't use it anymore. Like this
I
is
do
past
not, I
tense,
would
right?
not fucking, I wouldn't. Like you couldn't pay me to smoke it anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So this is
So
not
it's very,
encouragement. Everyone, like, I
yeah,
never
yeah,
encourage people to
yeah,
either. Different strokes for different
right,
folks. Let's
yes.
let's
So,
let's hear
yeah.
your analysis.
Okay, now as far as like what does it like what do I mean when I say it's a great high? It turns up all my neurotransmitters and makes everything so much more intense. Uh like most good drugs do, you know. When you have like a peak high on almost any drug, where the colors are brighter, the sounds are louder, your endorphins are pumping, uh, you feel like you are have been given access to some kind of energy or insight that allows you to conquer life's problems.
Mm-hmm.
It gave me all of that in abundance. And it gave it to me with a flavor that I particularly liked, which was like the tryptamine trippy kind of existential. I really like the drugs that have like the mind fuck aspect of it,
Mm-hmm.
uh, where it's not just pure pleasure, but it almost kind of makes you terrified a little
Uh-huh.
bit, and then the pleasure comes from grappling with the
Uh-huh.
terror.
Uh-huh.
So a lot of shrooms can be like that, for example.
Yep.
So if you like the headier aspect of shrooms, you would probably like DMT. But it's very potent. I mean, it's kind of like imagine if the visuals and the head trip from the strongest mushroom trip you've ever had, but they hit you in like a minute
Right.
or less.
There
Like
was no build up. It was just like
yes,
you're
it's
here
like
and then you're there. Yeah.
yeah, like
Yeah.
you're exhaling the smoke and it's like
Yeah.
But that's not every time. I mean, that's if you smoke like a certain dose at a certain pace, you can achieve. There's the lingo for it is breakthrough. I'm kind of like weary of all this. The I I used to be very attached to the drug culture and the drug lingo, but now I see it not so much as a positive thing. So even though I describe it as a breakthrough, I don't even know how I feel about trying to typify the experience into all that kind of stuff, but
You're
it can be
penetrating a membrane from between one reality and
right.
another.
That's a
Yeah.
good way to put it. However, I also would smoke DMT a lot in small doses. Like I would do things like just hanging out with friends where I would just like in between weed, I might take like one hit of DMT just to kind of like spice everything up. And I it is hard to put into words, but I don't feel like it needs to be put into words because it's not really that different from uh and when you said that you feel like you've been there when people describe the DMT experience, the general consensus is that humans produce DMT. We aren't exactly sure precisely which organs produce it, although a lot of people think that the pineal gland produce it.
And then some people think the lungs, right?
Well, exactly. See, the precursor, the protein that codes for it or some such thing. I forget the exact way to express it in chemical terms, but the gene that is required to produce DMT is present in the lungs and also actually in the retina of the eye.
Huh? No, not
Uh,
surprising to me at all.
right? It
Mhm.
makes sense. But so we still haven't established like exactly which of these things actually produces DMT and when, because to do so, we would basically have to be testing a live human body at the moment of DMT release, which is very hard to obtain under ethical circumstances in a laboratory environment. But there has been DMT tissue found in the lungs, in the brain of animals and a bunch of other mammals. Uh, so the point being that the general consensus is that most people produce DMT on their own at some point in their life. My opinion is that it's not even the same thing for everybody. Some schools of thought and science think that all of our bodies work the same and the pharmacology is written in stone and all the little chemicals do the exact same thing. And other people are like, no, we're all different. You can't uh write off one experience and expect everything to translate exactly from one body to another. So I don't think that there's an easy way to say like, yes, we have a DMT release when blank.
Right.
All types of people have speculated it comes at birth, it comes at death. There are people who have said it comes at orgasm. There are people who said that it comes in moments of trauma.
Yep.
Uh, it might happen in all those things, but we don't really know because we haven't been able to actually actively test the blood of a live human while they're experiencing those things,
Right.
specifically for DMT. But yeah, I mean, uh, and here's one reason I stopped smoking it is because I learned how to obtain a natural DMT state.
Yep.
I was going around the same time I was very heavy into the DMT. I started attending a temple and I got very heavy into meditation. And I was meditating for like an hour to an hour and a half every day for about a year. And I had another year of kind of like building up to that. In that temple, they would build up the meditation. So first you would do it for a few minutes, then half an hour, then 45 minutes, an hour, etc. So I went to the temple for a couple years, and that was around the time I phased out my DMT use because I realized I could get myself that high just with my own brain. And then combined with the overlap of various other issues in my life that I don't want to blame them on the DMT, but it is a very strong drug and it can be challenging to use it actively and to still maintain certain standards of life and behavior that
Yep.
others might expect of you because it does so strongly affect one's consciousness.
Yep.
I'm not going to put a judgment on it as to whether it's good or bad, but it was just, I had gotten enough of that. I had spent enough time in that space. And yeah, I mean, I do think that we can kind of induce it with meditation or certain things, but I'm not a chemist and I'm not going to try to prove that, I'm not the person to ask about that. But, I'm in touch with people who are. I mean, I interviewed Rick Strassman for my new book. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
course.
He's done most of the research on DMT out at the University of New Mexico. He's a great guy. His perspective on it is very interesting, actually. He doesn't agree with the very popular idea that it is a reliable way to induce a spiritual experience.
Uh-huh.
He actually thinks it's unpredictable and that people who think that it's going to give you that every single time, that's not correct. And he's very cool. His take on it, as one might assume based on his experience, is very mature and very cool. But yeah, I mean, I've talked to him because I was so obsessed with DMT and I've written so much about it. I was trying to get to the bottom of like, what is the science, like what's actually happening. So the truth is we still don't know a lot about it because Rick's research in the 90s was really kind of, well, there had been some earlier research, like for example, the Freemasons funded some research on DMT in the 70s.
He did.
And some
Of course.
scientists, yeah, some scientists associated with the CIA were messing around with it in the early 60s, but there wasn't a lot of like scholarly grade research on it, you know. So it's very new. We still don't know a lot about it. And even Rick, I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but he's generally very hesitant to assign specific effects or qualities to it because he has seen it produce so many different things and he knows that it's not that predictable, even though, you know, there's this idea that DMT is like the spirit molecule and it will connect you with God and you'll see DMT machine transforming elves and all this shit. But that's like, for the most part, that's all just cultural blah. I
Well,
don't
I
really
mean,
think there's
it's
much
like
real substance to it.
I read his book when it was like, kind of, I don't know if it was like exactly when it first came out, but it was when it was at its peak of popularity in terms of
Right,
getting interviewed and
right.
people making, documentaries about it. And my takeaway, and I've read one other book that correlates it with things from Jewish mysticism that he wrote.
Yeah, that's an
Right?
excellent book as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So my take on him is that like he's a person who's interested in this, but he's not a proponent or a detractor because he doesn't really know. He's still doing his thinking about it. He's not done thinking about it, right? He doesn't assume that he knows everything. And I think your point earlier, and this gets into lots of different avenues I go down in my own topics of research and whatnot. 100% we're all different, right? And like people think, when people think about like bloodlines, they're thinking about genetics and family trees in terms of like, oh, this family is a wealthy family and they have this
Right.
crest and they're from this place and that place. But no one is thinking about actually what is the chemical makeup of their blood. What trace
Yeah.
elements do these people have in their blood that make them have more of a tendency for this kind of behavior, this kind of talent, this kind of skill, this kind of response to certain stimuli or whatever it is, right? And there are literally elements that can be present in people's blood that might make them super conductive, right?
Okay. Yeah.
That might make them less than the average amount conductive. And so this is the way energy runs through your
Yeah.
body.
Yeah,
So of
totally.
course you're going, if you have someone who's hyperconductive or superconductive, what that means is that person has very low electrical resistance. Means like they're going to travel really, they're going to be able to, if time travel or dimensional travel is a thing, that's going to be the person. They're going to be able to withstand energy fields that certain other people can't. At the same time, they're going to be more sensitive to stuff because something that someone might feel just a little bit, they may feel a lot or whatever it is, right? So literally every single body on this planet is a different machine than every other body. And how it responds to the gas you put in it to go, just like cars, some of them need 92, 89, 87 octane. You have to treat your car with this oil, that oil, or whatever. Like our bodies are not that different. Our diets, everything, we're going to respond to every single substance differently. Right. And so to me, like, I'm sure, like that's what anybody who's studying this honestly is like, that no two people's, they take your blood when you participate in a drug study, right? They take your blood before they start on it. I'm sure some people who don't get chosen for the study, it's because even though they're not talking about it, they're well aware that people that have that in their blood, like that's a mess to deal with and we don't even want to deal with that, or this person will not have any response and we don't want to have to explain that to people. So there's like a certain band of frequencies that they're looking to sort of tune into or whatever it is, right?
No, totally. That's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. I also am I remember what you said on our last conversation about the debate about whether DNA actually is like the vehicle of such importance that it is often assigned, like, or whether the life force maybe lies in other places or like reactions, or maybe it's
Hmm.
not reducible to a single acid. I don't know. That kind of stuff is very interesting, especially when you use what's already happening with the drugs, and then, I mean,
I think it's possible DNA might be a drug.
yeah, well, yeah, I've thought
We might
about
be
that.
tripping.
Well,
We might be tripping on the thing that is called the human experience, and it's
yeah,
been something that we were dosed with at a certain
yeah,
point, and it's been a long trip, buddy.
yeah. I've thought about that as well, like really high, like really high. I came to a similar, I don't know, it's hard to say with certainty, but yeah, yeah, that's
Here are
definitely
the things you find yourself thinking about,
yeah,
right? And it's so different than like the normal set of things you think about. And then
right.
grab a few concrete ideas. And when you go research them, they seem to be the same ideas that the highest level nuclear scientists and engineers
Yeah,
are working with. So
totally.
it's a fair way of getting information so long as you're not 100% certain it's so.
Right, right, right. Yeah, interesting.
So okay, so one of you I read, and the part of the reason I wanted to talk to you about this was because I read some of I just decided and I had this feeling back several months ago when we met, which in some ways was why I put off reaching out to you again, because I knew that once you and I really started to talk, there's probably going to be an endless number of things we could talk about, and I
Yeah.
wasn't like in the place for more of that then, and I'm more in the place for that now. And it's very interesting, your interest in sugar and salt. Those are topics that I've done quite a lot of work on. Sugar, I had a whole series on sugar
Cool.
back in 2017
Nice.
that was literally at the time sounded like the rantings of a mad person, but has been proven to be almost 100% accurate. And
Yeah.
I've been pretty far down the salt rabbit hole for the last couple of years, and now really moving into a whole other area of salt research. So I would love to talk about those things with you sometime. But I
Yeah.
just decided to start reading your blogs from the beginning and just move through them at whatever pace I did. And so I read about your tryptamine experiences and what your use patterns were with them, and then that you don't do them anymore.
Right.
So, can you kind of tell us just a little bit about that experience of sort of hopping from one tryptamine to the next tryptamine, and how your experience, both on them and then later when you decided not to do them anymore, wasn't very different than people who do the drugs that we most often think of when we talk
Yeah.
about quote addiction or
Right.
dependence or
Right.
whatever. You to
Right.
go down
Totally.
that path a little, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, and that you kept me on track, because I know I'll totally go on all the tangents with you. But this is a very important topic that I think has only more recently, well, there have been folks like Rick Strassman, for example, and others who have been more concerned about the potential risks for a long time. But in more recent years, with all the commercial support and whatnot, uh, folks haven't really been talking about this as much, although like more recently that's begun to change. But what happened with me, I mentioned earlier that when I was a teenager, I was like really into acid and DMT. Um, in large part because those are what I could access, and I'd love to discuss with you maybe in another call, like, why was there so much acid and DMT around me when I was in high school? That's kind of weird. But anyway, um, you're talking about like oracle experiments and stuff, but anyway, to keep it on track here. So the acid was the first one. So the acid I was using like the DMT, where I just would use it every chance I could get. I would get as much of it as I had money for, and trip as much as my brain could handle it, and find friends I could trip with. And that was really like a big focus in my life for a while. Why I eventually moved away from the acid is I had begun to dabble with other drugs that were not synthetic, And it's hard to say if the natural versus the synthetic thing itself, I don't want to attribute too much to that because I think people tend to make more of a difference out of it than they should. But like whether or not it was a placebo thing of me thinking the natural drugs were different or something, with the drugs that I was using that were more natural for whatever reason, I enjoyed the trip more. I felt like it was a more accurate experience. I felt like when I was high on like mushrooms, for example, that the ways it affected my perception were more true to reality. Whereas with acid, like acid is one of the few drugs that I've ever taken where I actually would agree that it has caused hallucinations.
Mhm.
A lot of people argue like when you trip and you see things, like the most traditional school of thought is it's all hallucinations, it's all just your brain going haywire. A lot of people who do drugs say no, it's all real and it's all just stuff that the normies can't see. I'm kind of in the middle where I think a lot of it is real, but there's also some of it that is actually just bullshit that your brain is making up. And I got more of the latter on the acid.
Mhm.
Um, like I remember on one occasion I looked out the window and I saw like a giant chicken head just like hovering
Mhm.
outside with no body. It was like that's definitely not there. I'm not sure if like but I was seeing it. I could see the eyes and the beak and the feathers. I was just like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, and with the mushrooms, they would get me just as high, but not in a way that would produce hovering large chicken heads or like if I would was trying to go to the make some food like on acid, for example, like the counter would start to melt and turn into graffiti and
Mhm.
words and I wouldn't even get to the point of making the food because I would get lost in trying to read what the writing on the counter said that wasn't even
Yep.
there.
Yep.
Whereas on mushrooms, it's like, no, dude, you're hungry. Just make some food. Come on, man. Just get a fucking like whatever is around, eat your like nourish your body. It was a little bit easier to maintain that connection to
Yep.
the
I
physical
agree
world.
with
So
everything you're saying. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so I for those reasons I tended to prefer it because I liked to trip like often. I liked to trip as much as I could handle it. And when I was doing the drugs that really took me into the hallucination land, it was more I was actually I would be more crazy. Whereas on the mushrooms and stuff, it was a little bit easier to maintain my sanity and to be able to interact with people when I wasn't tripping.
Yep.
So I gravitated, although in between the acid and the mushrooms was the DMT. And again, like we could speculate about why these things were made available to us at those times, but
Right.
for whatever reason, I got like very much into the DMT. There was a lot of it around. And I think I already mentioned this, but I liked it in large part because it was quick.
Yep.
Uh it was pretty reliable. I mean, I've had times where I take a hit of DMT and like nothing happens. But generally, it was a pretty reliable way to have like a pretty interesting experience in a short amount of time. And then I could get back to doing whatever. I mean, it's a lot of the typical reasons you hear people are drawn to DMT, but because I did like to uh get in that space very often, the DMT was particularly nice for that because I could smoke it again, like I said, like while I was hanging out with friends and have a whole like mini little trip experience just in a few minutes and then be back down to baseline so we could go out later or whatever.
Yep.
So I was doing that a lot for a while, but again, even though the DMT is a little bit more natural, it is very potent and it can also tend to very quickly remove one from consensus reality in a way that is challenging to maintain your attachment to the material world when you come down. So I found myself for practical reasons having to ease up on the DMT because I was just so high that it was hard to actually connect with people and to interact with people because they weren't smoking DMT all the time, so they didn't really understand anything I was talking about.
Yep.
And I realized I didn't really want to spend my whole life in that space where like and this is when I kind of began to gradually realize like then I eased off the DMT and got more into the mushrooms, and I used the mushrooms for years, very often, everything like the microdosing, the bigger doses. My thing was I like to combine them with MAOIs. And I would also combine like
Syrian roux and stuff like that.
yeah, I loved the Syrian rue. I would use a lot of passion flower. Um, Raw cacao is actually a really great MAOI. There's others. I was really into the MAOIs, and actually after I stopped using the tryptamines altogether, I needed to use MAOIs because the chemical equilibrium I had created in my body,
Ah,
we can get to that, but here first, so it's like I really was truly habitually dependent on the combination of tryptamines and MAOIs, where if I went more than maybe 2 or 3 weeks, like without a big dose, and not by big dose, I don't mean a Kalindi Iggy dose. I never went as far as he went, but I mean like a couple grams or more and some MAOIs, so it really would like pack a nice punch. If I went more than 2, 3 weeks without that, my entire emotional state would just totally shut down.
mhm,
I would get very depressed, anxious, didn't want to talk to anybody, but I was not willing to recognize it for what it was because in my mind, what was happening is I need to trip again. I
mhm.
wasn't thinking, oh, I'm getting depressed, I'm getting anxious because
Because
I
I'm
didn't.
tripping.
Right. Like I thought it was like, oh, I haven't tripped in a few days, time to dose up. Like, and I maintained that for like a decade, like a good 10
Wow.
years where I was tripping like very regularly. I, it's around like 200 trips
Wow.
plus, plus microdosing for years in between all the big doses and stuff. Um, Now after I eased up on the DMT and got more into the mushrooms, at this point I had been using these drugs habitually for so long that I began to wonder if I was able to function without them.
Mhm,
I was like, wait a minute, I've been tripping since I was like in high school, and I was in my mid 20s. Um, and I began to wonder, like, am I even capable of, like, because if I tried to go a long time, like, without, and how I would justify this to myself is like, oh, actually, I need to trip. And it's natural because, of course, I do think that drug use is a human right. I think we all should be able to use, well, I don't even like to use the word right because when we ascribe like behaviors the identity of a right, it assumes that there is some form of authority whose job it is to bestow that upon us. And I don't
mhm.
like to conceive of our behaviors in that way. So I wouldn't even argue in the most radical form, it's not even a human right because it's a human fact of behavior that
Yep.
we cannot depend on anyone to bestow their permission on us for. All of that aside, um, I did it began to concern me that like, wait, like, do do I need these things or have I developed an attachment to them where I have because I also noticed that all the time that I spent doing drugs was time that I didn't spend doing other things,
Mhm.
like building relationships with people and trying to maintain all sorts of things in life that you don't really pay much attention to if you spend all your time just getting as high as fuck every day. Which it's not to say that you can't do all these things at once, but in the drug culture that I grew up in, which is very much like dictated by rap music and movies and advertisements and the dispensary weed with the 30% THC and this whole culture where drug use is framed as kind of like this escapist like luxury that is both cool because it's not allowed, but it also is allowed, so you can do it. And I was I very much was caught up in this whole thing where it's like, oh, I don't want to be part of the system. That's why I use illegal drugs because I use illegal drugs because they're not legal and I'm not a normal citizen. And just all this weird shit where it's like what's really going on here? Like, why do I actually use these things? You know, am I able to actually develop my life without doing shrooms every other weekend or every weekend or microdosing constantly? Um, and I just wanted to see if it was possible. Oops, sorry. Sorry. I was beginning to want to see if it was even possible because I had been tripping for so many years at that point that I couldn't go more than a few weeks like without it. And this was around the time that the pandemic hit. It was also around the time that we passed, I'll say a decriminalization measure, although I'll put the decriminalization in quotes because there's all sorts of like legal fine print about what it actually means and stuff.
Yes.
But we passed some form of a decriminalization bill for mushrooms and other plant-based tryptamines and phenethylamines in DC. Um, and all that and the pandemic were happening at the same time, and I lost my job due to the pandemic. So there was just a lot of very like rapid changes going on in my life and in all of our lives at once. And um I had already been kind of beginning to look at my own drug use from a more critical perspective. And then when the pandemic hit, it just totally shook everything up. And it felt like tripping would have actually been like maybe doing me more harm than good to
Mhm.
continue it. Uh, and like the way I conceived this to myself at the time is like a lot of the science posits that what tryptamines do is they reduce the blood flow to the default mode network, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for your daily tasks of survival and maintain uh like routine maintenance. And this is what the science says, although we both agree that the science is totally up for debate and whatever. But how I thought of it at the time is like I'd been using the shrooms and stuff to take me outside of my default mode network. But now with the pandemic, with no job, with all this stuff happening, there was no default mode network left. I
Yeah.
didn't need to take shrooms to trip because life was totally upside down. And I already felt on top of the fact that I had already tripped a couple hundred times, it's like, oh, now it's the end of the world. You know what I mean? So I felt like it actually would have been not good for me to trip when all that was going on. And then as I went more and more time without tripping, I realized, and this is what you probably read about in my piece, I uh, essentially experienced what I believe were withdrawal symptoms.
Hmm.
And I say that with caution because the psychologist of drug use, James Booth Davies, and others have done really excellent work where they question like whether the withdrawal symptoms are actually attributable to the pharmacology of the drug in question, or if they're attributable to the psychology of our behavior when we decide to take the drug. That's a
Hmm.
whole subject for debate that we don't have to get into right now. But in any case, like whether it's because the tryptamines were causing a chemical reaction in my brain, or whether it's because I was using that behavior as a coping mechanism for certain things in my life or whatever, I noticed that going along like weeks and weeks without tripping, there were very serious things in my life that were changing that were not good. My mood was terrible. I was very anxious, like very depressed, didn't want to talk to anybody, didn't want to deal with anything or anybody. And probably the worst thing was I could not sleep. I actually developed very severe insomnia that I actually still am still dealing with, frankly. Like there are times where I kind of can get it under control, but this is really the big thing that I kind of wanted to point out to folks when you mentioned that you want to talk about this is and again, it's hard to say with any certainty that this is because of the chemical effects, but my hypothesis as to what happened with me in this and the tripping and what is probably happening to a lot of other people right now based on the reports that I've seen is the receptor in the brain that the tryptamines are most active on is serotonin,
Hmm.
which you probably know is very much involved with the regulation of our circadian rhythm.
Yep.
And it also is involved with how our body responds to light.
Hmm.
And hence the circadian rhythm, because the circadian rhythm is basically the clock by which our body responds to the schedule of light and other stimuli that are available. And the serotonin is right in the middle of all of that. It's very crucial for that process of when you see the sun, you feel awake. When the sun sets, you feel tired and you go to bed. Your mood about the continuity of life going forward as the sun sets and rises, all of that is very heavily tied to serotonin to whatever extent we can say that this stuff has a chemical basis that we know of, right? I think that this process is probably what is behind the disruption of my sleeping.
Hmm.
And I know that might not sound like the worst thing because it's like, okay, well, like people who are withdrawing from alcohol and benzodiazepines can die. That's obviously worse, right? Yes, that's worse. I'm not trying to compare tryptamines to another drug or say that they're as bad or as good as another drug because I'm not in the business of trying to qualify and compare drugs. But I do think that tryptamines can produce withdrawal symptoms that can be extremely disruptive to people's life, you know. I actually do think, I don't have an example of this, but based on my own research and my own personal experience, I do believe it is possible to put your body into a state from habitual use of tryptamines where one could actually die. And I say this because ever since I've stopped the use of tryptamines, I have dealt with periodic episodes of what I believe is serotonin syndrome.
Hmm.
Are you familiar with that?
No.
It's basically the name for like an overdose of serotonin in your body.
Ah, so this sounds very similar to saccharin disease with sugar. And you've done research on sugar.
Oh,
Probably heard of it,
yes.
right? That people who are sensitive to sugar, it's not because they have high blood sugar, it's because they have naturally low blood sugar. So they have an extreme response to even small amounts of it. And then also sometimes create this surge
Yeah.
that is like a flooding of the
Yeah.
system, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would imagine it's probably something along those lines that I actually think is happening to me with my serotonin. Um, because after I totally quit tryptamines altogether, the only way I could fall asleep, wake up, maintain any sort of engagement with the world at all was through daily use of MAOIs.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and I'm
Monooxi-
still
Monooxidase inhibitors.
inhibitors, yeah. And for listeners who are not aware, I'll just give a quick breakdown in a nutshell version. So there are enzymes in our digestive system called monoamines or monoamine. Well, there's a whole bunch of different of enzymes that metabolize all sorts of different things, but one particular class of them oxidizes
Amine,
monoamines. They are known as monoamine
oxidase.
oxidase
Yeah,
enzymes.
that's it. That's what I meant to say. Yeah, okay.
Okay, now what monoamine oxidase inhibitors are a class of compounds. They're often drugs, but they can be found in food as well that inhibit the monoamine oxidase enzymes in our digestive system, which means they turn off the enzymes that metabolize a whole host of drugs and compounds in the food. What this means in a practical sense is that MAOIs, as they are often known, make a lot of drugs more potent. They also make our own neurotransmitters more potent, like
Uh,
our own dopamine and serotonin and the norepinephrine that we produce on our own. The MAOIs allow those to remain active in our bloodstream for much longer periods and in higher doses than they otherwise would. And I basically am in a state currently where to maintain my own health, I need to habitually dose with MAOIs to be able to maintain a sense of well-being that is comparable to the quality of life that I achieved with habitual dosing of tryptamines.
huh.
and I've tried to get off the MAOIs, but honestly, I mean, like, what's the fucking point? I'm like, damn, I just want to do some drugs, you know. At this point, I get so high from the MAOIs that it's actually comparable to how I used to feel from tripping. Uh,
Ah,
I've found like certain little things and certain little ones and extracts that do the trick for me, and I can take them and be like, and I feel like a mushroom trip, but it doesn't come with a lot of the same effects on my body and my mind that the shrooms did. Although I do still think I am reliant on them. Although again, I would not argue that's a problem or a disease. I think all humans are reliant on drugs. So, but do I think everybody should do this? No. I think I rely on the MAOIs because I did use the tryptamines for so long
yeah.
that I did something to the balance of the neurotransmitters in my brain where if I don't take anything now, it's like I
It's almost like
literally,
insulin for a diabetic. Like once you
yes.
mess it up
Yeah.
so much, then you need to,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's like I need to take something for it to be able to function, or else I literally don't even sleep. Like I've had periods where I'm literally awake for 3 days at a time,
yeah,
no sleep. And when it gets really bad, I can't. Well, but the serotonin syndrome is the scary part, and that's really what I wanted to bring attention to real quick here, because that is the point where this actually could be lethal.
right,
I'm very fortunate because I've always been around loved ones when it has happened to me. So I've never been entirely alone when this occurs. Uh, but it can be lethal if it happens in a severe enough way and you are not tended to, because the serotonin is actually directly implicated in the heart function. And what happens, I believe that because I've had to be careful because even though I rely on the MAOIs for my mental health and even my physical health, if I take them every single day for like weeks at a time and I don't take a break, then the serotonin syndrome happens,
okay,
which I believe is because of a buildup of the serotonin in my system to where it gets to a point where it's essentially toxic.
mm-hmm,
And what happens is my body temperature goes totally haywire. Spikes, drops, sweats, hot flash, cold flash. It alternates. My blood pressure drops so low that I literally can't even move.
mm-hmm,
Uh, and it's like just this really bizarre kind of head trip. It often is accompanied by emotional distress,
yeah,
as one would imagine, but it's not even just due to the episode. Be, due to the buildup of serotonin, there's often emotional turbulence that kind of will precipitate this. And then while I'm going through an emotional thing, this will happen, and I'll get hit with something where all of a sudden my body stops working, basically.
yep,
I I pretty much collapse, although I thankfully haven't actually like just falled over and hurt myself, but I basically have to like sit or lie down and I can't move. Heart is racing, my body temperature drops, totally covered in sweats, and it takes me like a good hour to recover from.
mm,
And then after that point in my headspace, I feel as though I just had a trip where it's like, oh my God, the existential crisis. I'm so glad to be alive. Woo! And your neurotransmitters are kicking and oh
right,
my God, I'm back, you know, that kick that I
yeah,
used to get from tripping, like my body will naturally just give it to myself now. It's honestly scary though, because I don't always know when it's coming. It's not predictable at all. It has happened in very inopportune times before that are kind of weird, you know, but so that's what I'm currently dealing with. Which is why I don't encourage people to smoke DMT. And it's not that I think if you smoke DMT once, you're going to get not that at all. But for people who are really into getting high, if you
yep,
really like shrooms and acid already and you like to smoke drugs, just really be careful around the DMT because it's like any other extremely potent drug. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it can have an effect on us that's very hard to deal with. We still really don't know a lot about it. And I think other people have had experiences like mine, but that it is new enough to the literature that it's not very well documented. There's not a lot of really established scholarship on this
yep,
happening, but I think it happens. I mean, that's my best explanation for what's happening to me after 10 years of constant tripping and then trying to stop and then using MAOIs to maintain my well-being, but also now I deal with the serotonin syndrome randomly. It's like I've had it maybe two, three, four times in the last year. So it's not very frequent, but it does happen periodically, and I don't really know when. So
Hmm.
that's kind of freaky. And I do think it's because I have fucked up my serotonin receptors. I mean, I'll say it. Again, I don't want to blame the drugs. That's just me being a teenager who really wanted to blow his brains out and finally did. And now I'm dealing with this, shit. But the MAOI is actually, when I can keep the balance in check, it's incredible. I mean, it feels like any other drug that people use that they say, oh, I take it and it's amazing and everything. And I'm not trying to say that they're the answer, because clearly what's going on with me is not ideal. I don't think everyone should be on MAOIs all the time. I think if you can maintain your well-being
Don't a lot
without,
of people take MAOIs as antidepressants, though? Isn't that part of
yes.
the
And
depressive?
that's why I'm concerned about this, because
Okay.
so what's interesting is that actually got big because in the 50s, the psychiatrists who were studying mood drugs had learned about ayahuasca, and they learned that there was a whole class of compounds in ayahuasca that made the other drugs and the serotonin and the dopamine more potent. And a lot of the early research on the psychedelics and ayahuasca, as well as uh, the Syrian rue that you mentioned,
Yep.
the scientists who worked with the CIA were writing about Syrian rue in the 50s and stuff. And a lot of that research actually it directly informed the development of the earliest generations of the pharmaceutical MAOIs. So
Hmm.
the whole use of MAOIs as a class of antidepressants in pharmaceuticals itself traces to all this, the pharmacology research that's tied to the military and all this kind of stuff. And then what we see with the SSRIs,
Hmm.
same story.
Selective serotonin
Yes,
reuptake inhibitors.
right.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that entire class wouldn't even exist if it weren't for LSD.
Right.
And now that we've dabbled with the SSRIs and we've seen that now folks are getting more interested in the LSD again, because
Right.
the taboo has worn off and it's acceptable now. So now they're getting back into the pure serotonin, the pure serotonergics, as opposed to the SSRIs or what have you. But yeah, I mean, all of this stuff has been commercialized, is being commercialized and weaponized.
Yep.
It's, for military purposes and the general population, on minors, on people who are considered like mentally ill, although that is itself a whole thing that is. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of, I think that this has a lot of implications for people. I would suspect that there are people who have been using the pharmaceutical. I mean, see, I'm really lucky because I've avoided the synthetic MAOIs like totally. I've never taken the pharmaceutical stuff. I've totally relied on the herbal MAOIs, and I think if I had been taking the pharmaceutical ones, everything I'm describing would probably be worse.
Well, you'd be in a hospital to deal with it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's only because the herbal MAOIs, due to the chemical composition, are easier for the body to metabolize.
Right.
And in those events where they do lead to an overabundance of serotonin, they're easier for the body to break down than
Mhm.
it would be if I was taking 100 milligrams of like whatever from the doctor that is like hardwired in there to just. So anyway, yeah, I mean that's my experience with it. I don't know if that's kind of if that answers your
Yeah.
curiosities or
Well,
more.
so now I understand why you were like, this might get pretty heavy, because I didn't realize that this was still going on with you in terms of the
Yeah.
after effects of your previous tryptamine use, right? Like I'm not, if you discuss that in your blog, I'm not to that point yet,
I
right? So
haven't really, well, the stuff that you wrote or that you read, I wrote
a couple of years ago.
about 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And at that point, I had been off the tryptamines for a while, and I thought that I was in the process of overcoming the
Yeah.
withdrawal symptoms. But now I've realized that even though I've overcome the worst of the immediate withdrawals from the habitually using the mushrooms, my serotonin is fucked. Like, sorry for the language, but
Yeah.
because I'm still dealing with this and it's weird, but yeah. So yeah, that's where I'm at. And yeah, thanks for letting me share. It's definitely weird stuff. I don't know 100% what's happening. I haven't been diagnosed for this stuff. I don't even think the doctors in most cases have a clue what's really going on unless they were to
And we live in
tell.
a world where you can't trust doctors. And so
Yeah,
it's really a
yeah,
difficult situation.
yeah.
Okay, so a couple of things. So first of all, thank you for being willing to share that here with me. I had no idea that this is where we were going with it. I have a couple of thoughts. So first of all, the way that it works sounds really similar to certain aspects of the diabetes with blood sugar with people, in terms of like, you have a problem if the blood sugar is too low, but you also have a problem if the blood sugar is too high. And both have like the weird things the body does in response to that. And then this almost like out of worldly experience that kind of goes along with it. And I have a lot of questions about what diabetes like actually is. What is really going on here? Where does this actually come from? And what role are the drugs that people think that are helping them with it playing in creating scenarios that are exactly like what you're talking about in your thing? So it sounds like similar but different, because it's operating on different systems.
Yeah, exactly.
But the sort of rhythm of it feels kind of the same. The other thing is, there's a lot of people who talk about that the same, even though it's not 100% clear what organs produce DMT, there is correlation between the organs that produce DMT and the organs that produce melatonin.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Well, do you know why?
I don't know if I know why, but I know some things about that. Tell me why.
The melatonin is actually a precursor to the DMT.
Okay.
So if I have my chemistry correct, serotonin typically metabolizes into melatonin.
Okay.
Which metabolizes into DMT.
DMT. Okay, perfect. Okay. So the reason what I was going to, and obviously melatonin is something that your body produces to help you sleep, or you can take it maybe supposedly to help you sleep. I don't know if it actually does, or if that's whatever, but there's lots of people, and there was a general category of story I heard for years, and then one very specific story that I thought was very interesting about oftentimes people who run marathons, regular marathons, 2 to 5 hours of running. But that when you run a marathon, you don't practice by running a marathon. You practice by running 5 or 10 miles multiple times a week, and then build right. Okay. But when they run the marathon, like after that runner's high passes and they have to push themselves to the end, and then they kind of, or they've stopped, they've either finished the race, and they may all of a sudden have a surge of melatonin and get very tired. But for some people, sometimes instead of a surge of melatonin, they'll get a surge of DMT and they'll start hallucinating right after the race.
Yeah.
As the system gets a little confused because the body's just done something that it's not done before, and its body doesn't quite know what to do. Right. So I've heard that many times. But I was actually listening to this chick named Courtney Showalter on Joe Rogan podcast a number of years ago. And she's an ultra marathoner. So she runs 200 miles at a time in races.
Oh, wow.
And she was talking about that, she was running the Moab 200 or whatever it was. And so there she is, amongst the rocks in Utah. And she had been running for about 24 hours at this point. She started to get like really tired, which that's that release of melatonin that we were talking about. Exactly. And then all of a sudden she is looking around, and it looks like she's in a jungle, and there's a tiger or a lion or a cheetah or something playing the violin in a hammock between two
That's so funny.
So she was tripping. She had a DMT release.
That's the DMT from the melatonin and the serotonin, probably.
Right. So like my guess would be that your body was so overstimulated in that one way that the over even though your body wasn't necessarily producing, I don't know that the body can always differentiate between when it is doing something on its own or when it has been stimulated to do something.
Right. It's a process. So
your body's been doing this thing that is this mimicking of the production of DMT, right? That then also just screwed up all of the mechanisms for serotonin and melatonin. So energy, joy, sleep, all of the different things to the point where it's like, it doesn't know what to do with it anymore. My guess would be that there are probably natural health people out there that know what to do in your case. In fact, I might even know one, right? Right. And so, but it's very, just like there's people out there who can get people off of diabetes medication. But it's a process. You can't just go cold turkey off of it without like a huge issue. Right. So I think
Yeah.
there's hope for you. I think there's hope for you. But
Well,
it's
that's good to hear.
right. It sounds like our bodies are like pretty high level machines. And
Yeah.
if you don't use them correctly, it will start doing all sorts of
Yeah.
other stuff.
Yeah.
Right. But even within that other stuff that it's doing is
Mhm.
evidence that we don't understand these drugs because
Yeah.
you're just having an experience that feels horrible to you on one level, but at the end of it, it's producing the same high that something that used to feel wonderful to you produced
Right.
as the experience you were looking to
Yes.
have.
Yeah, yeah, totally. It's very bizarre. Yeah, I appreciate you letting me explain this to you because it's been very, very hard to deal with and hard to explain to people. But yeah, that's definitely a good way to look at it.
So I'm going to make a suggestion here because we've been going for almost 2 hours and I
Uh,
do have to go to work a little later. And I think that was a lot to talk about for you. Why don't
okay.
we just call it a day here and put another date on the books for not too long from now to do our high dose thing? Because
Okay.
I think there's a huge correlation between what you're talking about here
Yeah.
and what has happened to the high dose heroes, as you
Yes.
put it.
I agree.
Right?
I agree.
I think both, I think them as people
Yeah.
and what ultimately happened to them is
Yeah.
misunderstood by everybody.
Yes.
But whether people think they're good or bad, all of
Right.
them are misunderstanding
Yeah.
everything about the scenario,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's highly correlated to that which we just talked about.
Yeah,
So
I
there will
agree.
be
That's cool.
Okay, so there will be a part two coming, hopefully sooner,
Sure.
hopefully sometime in the next couple of weeks. But it just feels like I feel like we've laid down quite a bit here, and like
Yeah.
this good stopping point. Do you
Yeah,
agree?
I mean, I'm happy to talk more, but I don't want to hold up your schedule, and we can always put a bookmark in this and pick up in a couple weeks. Yeah, I'm up for whatever. We can wrap it up. I know I tend to like ramble and turn everything into like a hour-long
Well, I
conversation.
do
So
the same thing. I do, so I that my audience is well used to hearing that, but I just feel like the next part could turn into equally as
yeah.
long. And if I
Yeah,
knew it
okay,
was only going
that's
to be an
fair.
hour, then I'm like, yes, let's do it. But I'm like,
No,
I don't
that's
want to
cool.
stop that
No, that's fair.
conversation either,
That's fair.
right?
That's
So
fair.
so
That's cool.
let's do that. But also before I let you tell people where they can find you and whatever, I do want to say that in looking into your studies on salt and sugar, which I've just barely tapped into, and that was why I was like, let's not even go there today, because I think that this is actually like, I did this whole show, like I did a series in 2017 called Sugar as Programmable Matter. And then
Ooh,
I later changed that. I started referring to it as Sugar is Programmable Matter.
yeah.
And about a year and a half after I completed that series, DARPA and Brown University put out a scholarly article on how much data they could store on a single molecule of sugar.
Ooh,
It was
ooh,
pretty
wow.
accurate.
Yeah,
It
that's
went all
cool.
over the place. I'll send it to you. It was in my
Wow.
very early days of media. I was very rough. I've considered redoing it just to make it more palatable to people who are scholarly and really interested in this.
All
But
right.
I can't recapture the energy with which I did that. And that was really important to what I was actually saying. So I've just left it
Yeah,
alone. I'll
yeah.
send it to you.
Please.
Yeah, I think that, the fact that you're talking about them as drugs is certainly appeals to me. But I
Yeah,
think that like they're and in what I've read so far in your works about it, all of the things you're saying about it is true. But I think there's an even higher level component to this story,
yeah,
and it has to do with compartmentalization of the same fields of experience that all of these other drugs
yeah.
that are illegal or maybe now legal but controlled by the same white coats that ruin
Right.
everything else or whatever it is. And it's getting into some of the same territory that we started this conversation with when you were
Yes.
talking about Rudolf Steiner and what was
Yes.
going on with this, like,
Totally.
well, you have this group of people who are like using it one way and another group of
Yeah.
people who are using it kind of another way, but they have the people who are using it that way growing the stuff for this. And
Yeah. Yeah.
there seems to be this weird obsession with restricting certain groups of people from certain elements or chemicals or whatever, imposing certain elements or chemicals on other groups of people. and then sort of making each thing that isn't available to one or the other illicit to those people to see if anybody does it. So there can be measurement of how they experience reality differently. And like what I'm kind of feeling like it is it's like if you have Hulu and I have Netflix, we are not having access to the same bands of reality, i.e. we watch different programming, right? And it's kind of like having a radio that only tunes into like 2 stations because your radio's shitty, or you live in an area that doesn't good reception.
Right.
Miles away or had a better antenna, you could tune into all of this stuff.
Yeah, totally.
All of those things are actually there.
Yeah.
Right. And we've been convinced maybe by some of these same chemicals that seem to be present in our life from about the same time people started reporting their experiences through any form of media that are either restricting or forcing us into one band on the radio.
Yeah, totally. 100%. I'm totally with that. Yeah. That would make a great like launching point for another conversation. And I follow 100%. I agree that there's definitely a lot more to it than just the drug angle. There's many dimensions to this that I'm happy to explore and connect and stuff. So that sounds great. I look forward to sharing how my own research can contribute to this and seeing where the conversation takes us.
Sounds awesome. So, all right, until you're back here sooner rather than later, and as soon as we stop the recording, we'll see if we can find an agreed upon time. Let people know where they can find your work, buy your book, support you in general. If you do take email or messages from people who maybe are going through some of the same things as you or whatnot. If you don't do that, whatever. But you've said some things here before that I've not heard anyone else talk about. And my guess is that someone in the audience is going to be going through something similar. And so then it may have questions. Yeah.
So there's a bunch of different places to find me. The easiest way is probably just to search my name on Google. That's Vincent Rado, R-A-D-O, although you can just grab my name from the description.
Rado. I thought it was Rado. Okay, Rado, my bad.
I mean, it's not a big deal. I don't really care. I say Rado, but you can find me on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I have my own website, which is illicit.news. That's ILLICIT.NEWS. I sell my books there, and I've posted one interview, and I'm planning on doing a lot more interviews and content on the website, but I haven't quite gotten around to that yet. But from my website, there are links to my Substacks as well as my book. I have a bunch of different things on Substack, so I won't like list out the HTML or the URL for every single one. But if you go to illicit.news, there's buttons that'll take you to. I have a Substack for my newest book that I'm almost done with called High and Mighty: How People in Power Use Drugs. I also have a Substack for another book I have in the works called The Politics of Psilocybin. And then I have a Substack for my most recent book, Drugism, which you mentioned at the beginning of the show, which is where most of my content on salt and sugar is. So yeah, I mean, again, if that's all too much, just search my name in the search bar. I'm sure you'll find something. As far as whether folks can hit me up, yes, I would say probably on Twitter. Twitter's probably the best place for now. I am open to talking about this with people. I actually have been contacted by a whole bunch of people who have seen what I've been through and have reached out saying, hey, I've been through something very similar. Can we talk? And I think it's important for those of us who have experienced this to connect. So I am open to talking. If Twitter is not the best way to communicate, find me on Facebook, or there's probably a way to send me a message through Substack. And yeah, that's probably the best places for now.
It would be very interesting to this is one of the things that I do with my chosen topics that I focus on is I've come to understand what the factors are, the connective factors are between people who end up in similar conditions or have similar experiences. And they're often not what you would think they were. Like a lot of people are very, oh, you look okay. Yeah, it's typical people of that genetic background have this disease or that, whatever. Like, sure, that's all true. but a lot of it has to do with being at certain places at certain times, what your parents' jobs were, weird, little things that you participated in as a kid and whatnot. And so my guess is going to be that there's a lot more of this out there than people are talking about, if for no other reason than they don't even know how to classify what they're experiencing.
Totally.
So, all right, awesome. Well, thank you. This went a little bit different than I expected, but really amazing. Like I've not heard this talked about before. So thank you for doing it here with me. And we will be back shortly with people love when I talk about Kalindi. That's been one of I've talked about Kalindi. I've never done a show about him, but he's come up in many shows about many different topics and different things, but I've never dedicated a show to him. And while this won't be dedicated to him, I think he's probably the archetype for what we're talking about. So it'll basically be about him, and people love when I talk about Kalindi. So I know they will look forward to hearing us talk about that and understanding all the sides of Kalindi, or at least all the sides that we can know, I don't know him personally. I don't know if you've met him before.
I met him once.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I know a bunch of people who know him or who knew him rather. We will get into this in the next call, but yeah, I look forward to talking about him. And there's a bunch of other figures and kind of who went through like similar things that we can discuss. Yeah, that sounds
All right,
great.
guys, that's going to wrap it up for us for this time. We'll see you next time. Thank you.